All right, everybody. Today we are going to talk about writing expressions. So in the event that you can't print, I know there's a lot more writing today, so I figured I would go ahead and type into this document. And so we're just going to follow along. I'm going to do this live with y'all in class, but just wanted to have you have access to this information again in case you need to hear something again. So in order to write expressions, like our ultimate goal is to be able to do things like, apply algebra to real life scenarios. In order to do that, sometimes we have to take things that are written in a verbal form and we have to try to write some sort of an expression or an equation to make sense of that scenario or whatever we're reading. So if we're trying to solve for, some unknown value, if we have a problem, an application, a real world problem, in order to make it applicable or make the algebra applicable to that problem, we have to be able to translate. So you'll see in this column here we have translation. We have to be able to translate some common phrases in math, and we are going to have to look at several different operations in order to do that. So the first thing we're going to look at, the first few probably feel familiar. Like you've probably done this before when you were in middle school, but we're going to look at taking it up, and adding some variables and up in the level a little bit because we're going to have some multi-step things happening. But just kind of starting off old school. You have addition, so you need to add. When you see phrases like these first three here, the phrase like the sum of a number and, or the sum of 8 and a number, how would we translate that? So what would that look like algebraically speaking? So we know sum is a key word for adding. So the sum of 8 and a number, we could write that like the following. The sum of 8 plus, I'm just using my keyboard here, a number. Now that's the weird part, right? So I'm going to use the letter X to represent a number. So when you're writing expressions, whenever you have like that unknown, that value that we don't know what it is, or we want to allow it to be to have multiple values, we're going to use variables. X is a common one, but you wouldn't be wrong here if you put B, 8 plus Z. You could use the variable first, the sum of 8 and a number. I know that's a common question some of y'all had about the order, which is perfect that you're thinking that way. You're not wrong if you put X plus 8 instead. Either one, right? So, or X plus 8. For a lot of our examples, I'm going to use X just to stay consistent here, but you're going to see that, really we could use a lot of different variables here. So addition, again, another way we could see addition is a number increased by 7. So increase is another key word, and I'm just going to use X to represent any number. So it could be anything. We don't know what number, but some number increased by 7. So we have our unknown that we're going to hold its place using that variable X, and then it increased, so add plus 7. It increased by 7. More than is also a signal to add. 5 more than a number tells us that, again, you have a plus 5, right? We have 5 more than a number. So we have our number, and we're going to have 5 more than that number would be the result. So an expression that would be equivalent to 5 more than a number would just be X plus 5. So we're going to take the same logic and we're going to look at subtraction, multiplication, division, and so on. So subtraction, the difference between a number and 4. So the difference between, with subtraction, if you remember back, again, got kind of kicking it old school, I know, but going back to middle school, I hope you remember, or you might remember your teachers talking about subtraction. The order matters with subtraction. So whenever it's sum, it's like, okay, I can just write it kind of how I read it, but it's not wrong if I flip it. Because if you add 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 2, you get positive 5, right? That doesn't matter. But when it comes to subtraction, we want to read it and try to write it in the order that the expression or the phrase here states. So if it's saying that we're trying to write something that represents the difference between a number, so a number comes first, so a number, and we're getting the difference between that number, so subtracting, and 4. So x minus 4, the difference between a number and 4. So we'll actually use the order for the subtraction. A number decreased by 8. Okay, so what do we start with? A number. It decreased by 8. I don't know if that's more helpful or not to try to spread it out. I don't know if the negative gets lost in there for you guys. Just experimenting here. 5 less than a number. So 5 less than a number, we're going to have, so you have to, this one's, we're kind of backwards because we want to have a number and then 5 less than it. So we want to take 5 away from that number. 6 minus a number. Now this one's giving us the direct, so it's saying 6 minus, aka subtract, a number. So 6 minus a number, which I'm just going to use x. Multiplication, the product of 4 and a number. So product being a key word for multiply. We can write 4 times x like this, just putting the coefficient in front of the variable. So a number, we're going to let that be x. And product, multiply, and y'all were doing great with this in class. This means you're multiplying. So whenever you see something written like that, you know you have multiplication. Another way you know you have multiplication is when you have 7 times a number. So 7 times a number. Again, multiply. Another way that you could see it, sometimes you see, I'll put or, you might see even, let me do parentheses. If you see this, or we talked about whenever you have 2 things next to each other in parentheses, parentheses tell us to multiply. And then 1/3 of a number. So 1/3 of a number, we have the fraction 1/3, and then the number, which we want to let it be any number, so we have that variable x right behind it. Now division, quotient is a key word. So quotient, if you want the quotient of a number and 8, that just means we take the number and we divide it by 8. That's the quotient. And I don't mind if you write your fractions like this, or if you write them like to where it's the x on top of the 8. You'll see me do that when I'm writing it by hand. A number is divided by 10. Okay, another way of saying this exact same thing. A number, so x, is divided by, so we're just going to use that little slash, divided by 10. A number is divided by 10. Okay, so that's another way to write that. Same idea. Just the number over and then your denominator, so numerator, denominator. The next one is where we get to some more of this Algebra 1 stuff, what we're kind of building towards, and we'll practice these. But here we have mixed operations. So we have to read really carefully because we're going to have more than one thing happening. And we say grouping required. So that just means that when we talked last week about distributing and putting things in parentheses to group quantities in parentheses, that's what you're going to see here. So if you have, we'll just kind of jump in here, 4 times the sum of 6 and a number. Okay, so 4 times the sum of 6 and a number. So right here, I know that I'm going to end up grouping. I'm grouping together, I'm going to kind of get myself, the sum of 6 and a number. Okay, so I'm going to group that together. And then I have 4 times, we'll make this one green. So 4 times the sum of 6 and a number. So I know that 4 times means to multiply. But I have this sum of 6 and a number. That's where your parentheses are going to come into play. The sum of 6 and a number, we did that up here, right? The sum of 8 and a number, it's just 8 plus x or x plus 8. So the sum of 6 and a number, so I could just put this as 6 plus for sum and a number. So this part, that is my translation of the sum of 6 and a number. But I'm multiplying that whole sum by 4 times. And so that's where that times 4 comes from. So 4 times the sum of 6 plus x is going to be how we would notate this phrase. Now, mixed operation grouping again, here we have the product of 4 and the difference, so product telling us to multiply, right? So the product equals multiply, okay? So the product of 4 and the difference of a number and 5. So if you want to start, we have, we know we're going to be multiplying by 4 again, the product of 4, but it's the product of 4 and the difference. So again, the difference of a number and 5, and just kind of grouping a number and 5, the difference of a number and 5, that quantity is what we're multiplying by 4. So we'll have that whole parenthesis here, like what's in parentheses, that's our difference, but we had this extra part today, or with this phrase, of a product, the product of 4 times that. So that's how you would write that. And then lastly, mixed operations grouping required, we have 75 is decreased by the sum of a number and 8. Okay, so we have, just reading it the way it's written, try not to overthink it, you have the number 75. So 75 is decreased by, that tells us to, get in the right box, Miss Sandoval. 75 is decreased by the sum. The sum, so I know I'm adding, but what am I adding? Well, I'm adding a quantity of the number and a number and 8. So x plus 8 is my quantity that I'm subtracting or decreasing the number 75 by. So the sum of a number and 8, this time that's what's in our parentheses. And we're decreasing 75, which means we're subtracting. So just kind of making those match. 75 is decreased by 75 minus, and then that sum. But you have to put the parentheses because we're not just subtracting the number or 8, we're subtracting the sum of that number. And so this might feel like, well, it wouldn't matter, right? Well, right now, remember our goal of the day is practicing writing expressions. As we go forward, you are going to find times where it does matter whenever we're grouping and subtracting. So make sure that you're trying. You're going to make some little mistakes. It's not a big deal, but we need to just practice and then see where we get stuck. So you're going to try these on your own for me. And then we will come back together and I will post the answers for these so you can take a look and see how you did.